overview of the book and some of the key implications, I think, from it. The book, as you may know, is available at a 50% discount, according to this leaflet in front of me. I do have some with me at the end if anybody wants it. A little bit more difficult for those online, but if those who haven't actually managed to read it yet, there is an opportunity. Have the first slide, please, Reese. Okay, I'm going to start with one of the main concepts in the book, and that's the idea of governing for sustainable development. So this is really drawing from the Brundtland report and the introduction to the Brundtland report, which describes sustainable development as a new global ethic. It goes further than talking about it as an ethic, though, because it actually talks about the type of governance we would need if we really wanted to make the changes to the purpose of what we do, to change development to sustainable development. The nature of those as recorded in Brundtland are set out on that slide, and have been, as I point out in the book, have been elaborated in discussions in academia around issues such as discursive and participative democracy, reflexivity in policy making, and this whole issue about how you create a sort of relationship between topics rather than treating them as discrete, separate topics in the classic manner, and how you actually create this a way of making civic dialogue rather than simply answering questions, which I think is what we do. I use, with encouragement of Harriet Friedman, who was one of my reviewers, I've used a lot of examples from my own career to illustrate the sort of tensions, particularly around what it is what it means to have governance rather than government, and whether that is something that is a different approach, and how sustainable development is developed. I was fortunate enough to work on this common inheritance, the first environment white paper in 1990. Excellent overview in sort of policy terms, but then it sort of went into individual chapters about individual topics, and the longest list of action points in any document I've ever produced. So it sort of got the idea that the delivery framework was a traditional one in that sense. And in some ways, once I produced the first year report as well, we killed the issue with sheer weight of documentation, I felt. Nobody could say we weren't trying. Rio Summit, excellent work on planning policy guides, if I say so myself, looking at things like reducing the need to travel, reurbanisation, which have really had impact. I don't pass the Sainsbury's local without feeling I may be responsible for it. But if you think about those changes that happened then, a lot of them have not really become normal. They think both transport policy and planning policy slips back into old ways very easily. Government Office, oops, we've gone forward. We've gone forward again. That's all right. Government Office Southwest, fascinating experiment in creating place, of understanding place, working with civil society a little bit further away from ministers, in a sense, where you were the front of the office. But then, really, that issue about what was your legitimacy in that space. How do you look over your shoulder when you're facilitating, what are you facilitating towards? In that space, followed by another experimentation in governance with the Welsh Government and devolution, with a real commitment to participative open governance, sense of place, work we did on spatial planning, creation of Natural Resources Wales, and finally the Wellbeing Act and the Environment Act. Really groundbreaking work, but again, all the time feeling an uphill battle, the different departments not being on the same page. The relationship between the participative and the representative never resolved. So that's what I've been looking back for the last 5.5 years to try and make sense of all this. And I suppose what I'm looking at is really, with the encouragement of the publisher to focus on bureaucracy, is how government does shape that bureaucracy shapes the way it can work, and shapes the relationship to the public, something that I think at a time when there's a lack of faith in democracy and a lack of faith in technocracy, that's a really important thing to look at. Secondly, this discussion I had earlier in the book about what does this move from government to governance actually mean? Is it just a rebranding where we simply make it seem a little more fuzzy and friendly, or is it actually a change in the way we work? Is it a more emancipatory approach, or is it just a different way of exercising control? And then finally, in the context of my particular work, what role have we played in the persistence of unsustainability as bureaucrats? So, you know, as Alex implied a minute ago, when we talked about technocracy, what we tend to, when we look at bureaucracy, we tend to ask, how do we make it more efficient? You know, how do we make them work a little bit differently? Surely another target, surely another indicator set, surely another delivery plan will make it all right. And this is stuff that's really based on the American economics literature that thinks we shouldn't have a bureaucracy at all. And that it's, you know, it's the last resort where the market can basically do anything, and you know, maybe it's not based on a concept of a civic role of civil society or anything like that. So what I try and do in the book, and what I think we should ask ourselves, is what is this thing called bureaucracy for? Should it not be more than simply this non-existent within constitution workforce that tries to do whatever it's asked to do in the most efficient way possible? Should it not have a clearer purpose? And indeed, an actual constitutional position, potentially, in this day and age, when the existing system is under attack, and the question of how democratic is democracy is a genuine one. And if that's the case, what would it look like? How would it behave? How would it be structured if we did that? So in the book, because what I tried to do was blend my practice of academia, so I had to use Foucault. It annoys a lot of people, which is always good too. But there are plenty of others you could use. But this sort of sense of, you know, what was this system designed to achieve? And I particularly picked Foucault because of my many years working in planning, land use planning, because he's the only person in political philosophy who's really interested in territory and the physicality of this. So that's why I picked him. But basically, it's all about this, creating this economic efficiency, nation-state economy order around that we're talking about. And the institutions and procedures and the way they run these things and the narratives they operate are all, in Foucault, designed to support that and sustain that. If we move on from Foucault, next slide, there isn't a very big step from Foucault to Max Weber's work. And Weber's very clear. You need a bureaucracy because you have modern industrial capitalism. That is what it is designed for. It gives rapid, uniform decisions, as he puts it rhetorically in the quote there, which is from the Protestant Work Ethic, for the tremendous cosmos of the modern economic order, which will last until the last ton of fossil fuel is turned to ash. That's genuinely Weber in 1900, so 1920 published. So there is a tension here between sustainability and the purpose of bureaucracy, one might suggest, if one looks at this. And the fact that we don't talk about that tension is actually really important. There's a quote, next quote is from Douglas Torgerson's work on democracy and sustainability, where he talks about this sort of aura of the past that actually obscures the way you can think about things and the bounded rationality that is being operated, that you don't actually notice that because there's this aura of the past and the way things are done. But there is a very strong tradition of people who thought that actually public bureaucracy should have a purpose, should be for something that's more than this. And particularly I'm picking the book on Dwight Waldo and his work through the 50s through the 70s, where he's challenging that this is an exercise in the nature of democracy in the state, and it is about social inclusion, it is about all those things, about non-domination of others and the ability to be a citizen of a republic. And I love his quote that, you know, you can't just be efficient, things are efficient or inefficient for a purpose. And I think we often forget that when we're looking at this. And equally, you can look at a long literature there, an alternative view, the American tradition. And the last one, which I draw on quite a bit in the book, is the Republican tradition, which is Philip Petit, the scholar, Irish scholar working in America, has put it. It's about minimizing the domination. That's the notion, domination of others. So non-domination is the purpose of governance. That's why you have the Montesquieu balance of powers, but all that was set up before we had bureaucracy. Bureaucracy has no current stated place within that, but it does mean that the design of institutions is paramount. This is a table that doesn't appear. I hope people can see it both in the room and on the screen. This is a table that doesn't appear in the book, but I thought it was useful for the connection of the agendas here. Andrew and I were talking earlier about the fact there's a lot of interest in different forms of governing, but those things are not really joining up anywhere or becoming a uniform dialogue. So on this one, I've looked at the purpose against the structure and practice here of different models. So we've got Weber, straightforward, we all sort of know that. Industrial capitalism, the analogy is an industrial model of production. It's a technocratic, it gets legitimacy from being technocratic and from its relationship to representative authority, in some cases. Its structure is very much one of bounded rationality. You're not meant to look outside your block. This is the thing you're responsible for. You take decisions on that. And it has all the things that we say we don't like in government, and a couple of that we don't think about enough, like reductionism and economic assessment, that underpins that. At the moment, this sort of broad, fashionable, better policy making of the current decade is going under this title of New Public Governance. And it is very much focused on this technocratic improvement, if you like, of it. Its analogy is networks, though I see Osborne uses ecology in his latest article, but it's basically a networked concept. And it has similarities to what we talk about in governance and sustainable development. Co-production, public value issues, integrated policy making, participation are all part of its dialogue. But it hasn't addressed any of the things that are there already. So these are effectively additive. And this is the problem I found through the career, that simply adding these things that are completely different to the way you are structured and the way your practice works doesn't suddenly miraculously change that. Just because you're well networked doesn't stop you being in a hierarchical, bounded rationality structure. It just makes the world more difficult and complicated for you. So if you look then at governance and sustainable development, it I think offers an alternative framework entirely to the one that we've inherited. And yes, there may be areas where you need elements of both, but actually it is a very different way of governing. And I think unless we begin to think about that, we're never going to get out of the current logjam we're in about the way we make policy. I wanted to test this out in the context of the Welsh Wellbeing Act. I mean, the Wellbeing Act that I've played a part in is still the only attempt to repurpose bureaucratic governance. I don't think it's been talked about enough in that context, but that's what it actually is. These are the behaviours you should meant to be having, and this is the purpose to which you're working. It's a way it's never existed. It was lovely to see in the first week's posters going up in the building with saying what the aims were. Never seen before in a government building, I'm sure. Maybe in Scotland when they have that really good programme of government for them. But anyway, that's this sort of sense of it being a legitimacy to have aims rather than just be this cog in the wheel of the machine. But I picked out here, again, this is not directly from the book, but most of it's in there. I picked out the discussions I had with senior civil servants about what had proved difficult. And what I've got there is just a few of the quotes. I mean, the first one, a structure to make you know as little as possible. I just think it's an excellent description of the civil service and probably most large bureaucracies, to be honest. And yet the Act tells you to collaborate. It tells you to get involved with things. Another quote, we are robots, aren't we? This sort of sense of just being machines that are there working. Headless chickens could be a quote from any civil servant, I think, particularly in the last few years. And yet you're meant to be looking long term. You're meant to be preventing things, and yet you've got these directed targets and KPIs that keep telling you to do this specific thing that probably isn't really relevant, but somebody's decided it would help from some central place. You're meant to be reflexive, and yet you've got this sort of desire to fall back on procedure, to do it in the way you know to do, to have a long action plan, to do all these things. You've got issues around the need for integration, but the whole pressure is to limit your scope. You want something manageable. You want something you can give an answer to. You don't want something that's too large. And you want to co-produce it and work locally, and yet you hate variation. We know what postcode lottery is, where things are different in different places. So what was interesting, it was just everything went back to the Weberian model and the way it works as we went through the discussion. Next slide, please. So in the book, coming back to my lovely Foucault, I redraw the diagram with different boxes in it. So institution and procedure is still there, but the whole thing of regimes of truth and narratives has become about discourse and dialogue, about the ability to create that civic discussion. And the place that is all about the ordering of territory and it has become the enhancement of natural systems and the plurality of place and diversity. And the bits about control is about self-regulation. Picking on Ostrom and the like is about closed loops and self-regulation. In fact, the only constant, bizarrely, is actually institutions and procedures. But maybe I was a bureaucrat for too long. But they would be different institutions and procedures. That's the point. If this is what you want to deliver, probably different departments. At the very back of the book, there is a chapter that is too précis in the manner of books. You finish them rather than complete them. You should just stop. But I summarize this as the tables from the back of the book. Summarize just the comparison of the different model of how you would work if you were going to work to this aim. The types of approaches and the way you move away from this Weberian stroke new public management approach of targets and numbers and the bounded rationality, confidentiality, the control, to something that's a much more enabling form. We can go on to the next one just so it gives, I mean, there are three of these in total, but I've only shown two, because it's also about, it's both the practice and the organisation. And in particular, sort of being able to unbound, to uncontrol, to actually engage, to get away from the dominance of the sort of economic and the finance and the market justification towards something that's actually about making people's lives better, making places better, and making them part of that possible. So in conclusion, clearly these inherited structures and practices do shape the way we can govern, and they are a serious motivation to the sort of transformatory change that we might be looking for. Frankly, at the moment, if we not just save the planet, but probably save democracy. I think things are almost that bad. The idea of governing for sustainable development is a potential unifying framework. It can embrace the civic republican concepts and the discourse concepts, and gives us a clearer sense of the change we want to do in terms of both the practice, but also the aims. This is not marginal efficiency. This is not just doing the same thing quicker or in a more joined up fashion or anything like this. This is fundamentally different. It does need this clarity of purpose. I think it needs legislation. The Welsh case suggests that even with that, it is difficult, but it gives you that basis. Probably if one had a constitution, it would need a constitutional change, and would need a constitutional status for the civil service. And I really do think that if we can get into the space of the new civic bureaucracy that I talk about, it's going to be really important for tackling this next century's issues. Thank you very much.